Welcome back to Decouple. Today I am joined by the one and only Jeremy Whitlock. I think your most important accomplishment, Jeremy, is that you've appeared on the Decouple podcast before. I mean, I'm a little biased, but you also have an incredible resume. People should check out your former episode. It's all about Can-Do. And Can-Do is in the news, if you haven't noticed. Reuters exclusive on the Case for Can-Do report today. A lot of hum in Ontario about this new Canadians for Nuclear Energy report. There'll be a link in the show notes, but enough of my self-promotion. Um, in addition to being a former Decouple guest, Jeremy works at the IAEA, and I'm going to let you finish off this introduction I've started. Try and keep it to like a 5-floor elevator ride. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. I'm very happy to make this return engagement on Decouple. And actually, just as an aside, I was talking to someone this morning having coffee, and out of the blue, they mentioned that they were a big fan of Decouple and, and yourself, and they follow every episode. But they didn't mention that they had seen me, so I guess they missed that one. But I said, funnily enough, this afternoon I'll be doing another one. Anyway, yeah. So I am a senior technical advisor, as they call me, at the International Atomic Energy Agency. The area of specialty here is safeguards. So I work with a team of people that help make the world safe from potential proliferators who want to misuse nuclear technology. And this goes back to my career at Chalk River Labs in Canada. I did 22 years at Chalk River, which is about 2 hours west of Ottawa. I also grew up in the area, so I'm a second generation nuclear person because my dad worked there as well. And I've been here since 2017, again working in safeguards. So safeguards essentially it's what happens when you sign the Non-proliferation Treaty, which is most countries. If you are a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, legally, according to the Non-proliferation Treaty, which are the P5 nations. If you're the other nations, that means you accept full scope, comprehensive nuclear safeguards on your entire state, your entire country, and that means that all nuclear material is under verification requirements.
This episode came about, because and you came back into my life, Jeremy. It was wonderful because I probably spent too much time, but at least a couple of weeks preparing for my debate with Dr. Gordon Edwards in Ottawa. That's about 3 shows back in the archives, the Great Canadian Nuclear Debate. And you have in addition to the IAEA and Chalk River, you also have an incredible website. I think it's called Canadian Nuclear FAQ. We'll link that in the show notes as well. But you have a long history of interacting with the Canadian anti-nuclear movement and some of its key members or ideologues or whatever we're going to call them. And so you were incredibly useful for prepping for that debate. So 2 things I wanted to cover in today's episode. It almost starting to feel a bit irrelevant as the anti-nuclear movement is starting to feel, to explore the anti-nuclear mind or mindset. So I don't know how much time we'll spend on that, but I did want to fact check some of the things Gordon Edwards said. And in our preparation for the debate, the issue that I found the hardest to get my head around and deal with was that of proliferation. And so I thought, who better to deep dive this further with than my good friend who I've never met before, Jeremy Whitlock. It's funny how these friendships grow, from doing these hour-long podcasts. But it's actually I think it's very rare to sit down and have a one-on-one with someone for an hour, like outside of work meeting or something like that. So anyway, it's something I've really valued from this whole podcast experience. And another great thing about the podcast experience is I think I'm over 200 episodes in, and I've spoken with some really interesting people. Again, we haven't really covered the bomb, which we really need to, or proliferation, but I have spoken with a proliferator, and that was Dr. Anil Kakadkar, who ran the BARC, the Bubba Atomic, I'm going to get that wrong, Atomic Research Center, and was involved in, he was the mechanical engineer behind was it the Smiling Buddha explosion? The peaceful nuclear explosions that India set off, I think, in 1974, and then the 3 explosions in the 1990s. So touching history like that, has been an incredible part of the podcast. But it was interesting talking to a guy who's been, involved in proliferation and the whole politics of it. That the already nuclear nations, the early comers, are like whatever. So maybe we'll get into that as well. But this is too long of a little diatribe. Maybe we can start off with the light and fluffy, and talk a little bit about your impressions and reactions to the Gordon Edwards debate, and explore a little bit the anti-nuclear mind, because I think there's still a lot of communication work that needs to be done by advocates, and it's really important to understand where those who disagree with us are coming from. And I think an empathetic approach is how you win arguments. You need to understand where people are coming from. So without further ado, Jeremy, what were your thoughts about the debate?
Well, yeah, and I'm empathetic to people who are scared of nuclear power, because who wouldn't be if you didn't know anything about it? I'm less empathetic to people who I know for a fact understand the science very well, and yet insist on trying to scare people about it. And so that brings us to the anti-nuclear people. Now, I've been around long enough in this field, talking to anti-nuclear folks, mainly in Canada, to have, I don't want to say outlived, but I am active longer than all of them. And I think that Gordon Edwards is the only one. I could be mistaken, but of all the people, there was Norm Rubin of Energy Probe, several others, and there was Gordon Edwards, and he's the only one I think that's still around of that generation. So I've been,
and to give the listeners a sense of this guy's longevity, it came to my attention that Dr. Gordon Edwards debated Dr. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, in Toronto, moderated by Canadian cultural legend Pierre Burton. I mean, it was 49 years ago, essentially, almost to the day that I debated him after. But, like, my hats really goes off to Gordon Edwards for his stamina. I think I've got some solid critiques, but anyway, I wanted to carry on. I just wanted to give people a sense of that, grand sweep of history. It's like what one human lifetime can experience. But anyway, sorry, carry on.
And you were generous to point that out in the debate right at the outset too, acknowledging the man's stamina. So he's definitely been around, well, longer than I've been involved. And he started off anti-bomb, and as many of the anti-bomb people evolved, he did too, to anti-nuclear power. And he sees the whole thing as one big thing to be against. He doesn't like nuclear technology. Despite what he says, he might say things to fuzzify that, but the essential truth about him is he doesn't like nuclear technology. And so he'll tolerate it a little bit if we have to put up with it, but really he would like, if he had a choice, it would go out the door. Sorry. And so everything that he says and does is motivated by that. Just regardless of the agenda of the meeting that he's attending or the topic of the talk, it's all about this thing has to go. And he's been telling that same story for decades. Various anti-nuclear spokesmen have different motivations and agendas. Some are more sincere than others, and some are kind of like they allow themselves to walk that hairy edge of truth. And I'm afraid to say that Gordon Edwards is one of these people. He's a very smart individual. He's intelligent. He's read all the material that's out there in the public domain, and he's able to regurgitate it at will. So he knows what's true. He knows where that boundary is, and he knows how far he can go beyond the boundary, to just enough to put the fear of the atom in people, but not to give them that extra little bit that they need to address the fear. So he'll say that radiation is like little mini explosions going on, and the radiation in your body are little mini explosions, and he'll use the word explosions. And when challenged on that, why would you have to say explosions? Because and I know that you are invoking the bomb in that imagery. And he'll say, well, they are explosions. It's energy being released. And it's like, that's an example where he knows that he's not lying, but he's just choosing to use very, very particular rhetoric to get a point across. And he does this with every one of the topics. So his three favorite topics then are radiation and all of its associated fear factors. So that includes accidents, and then waste. Basically, there's no solution for spent fuel, and he'll push this over and over again, which is not true. And then his main topic is proliferation, and it really comes around, which is his original entry into the into the field, where he is sincerely afraid that the world will come to a cataclysmic end because of nuclear technology. So I could be generous and ascribe that to that sincere feeling of his too. Yeah.
And I mean, that's especially for his generation. That is not an irrational fear. I mean, even let's be quite honest, for our generation, it's not a totally irrational fear. It always amazes me. I mean, I guess there have been some close calls. The Cuban Missile Crisis. I think there was a submariner, and a captain in a nuclear submarine who, maybe could have, should have had the order to push the button during the blockade of Cuba and did not. There was some close calls, from what I understand. And once you start slinging nuclear weapons, from what I understand, the game theory basically plays out to you don't end up with a little tactical exchange. You end up with the whole bit, which is terrifying, and it still should be, something that's terrifying to us, or enough to. I don't like terror, or like, the Greta Thunberg thing of, panicking, but like sober thought and consideration. And I guess that's, part of why you work at the institution you work at. Um, like what struck me with Gordon, in terms of trying to really, again, empathize and understand his psychology, is that the root of it is in the bomb. That's rational, particularly for his generation. But the thesis he has is essentially, we can get rid of the bomb and pretend it never existed, or just, hit, Control Alt Delete or whatever it is on your keyboard, if we can just get rid of every bit of nuclear technology. And that's why I talked a fair amount about isotopes. I mean, isotopes are made in power reactors, but I mean, he's even against isotopes being made in medical research reactors. And you were part of the team that helped coach me and get my knowledge base up on medical isotopes. But that's what I think really struck me, is that that's the fundamental thing in the flawed thinking. And I think you were also very helpful in terms of, you have to acknowledge that every reactor, yes, it does make plutonium. Is that weapons grade plutonium or of sufficient isotopic purity? No. Or, could a research reactor also potentially be used in a diversion program? Yes. Like, there's always a risk, but that was the framing I used of, the medical framing of, let's discuss this diagnostic approach or treatment decision, risks, benefits, and alternatives. And, just understanding that this profoundly human desire to stuff a genie back in the bottle of something you think is an apocalyptic threat, it makes sense, but it's not a sound argument, and the harms are very real. Be it air pollution in Germany now, or failure on climate goals, or again, I think more immediate, just all of the medical benefits of sterilization and cancer treatments, etc. So that was kind of my takeaway, and I really have to credit you for helping me, I think, develop that. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and you did a very good job of representing that view in the time you had too. Yeah, so he does have this advantage that so if you assume that you don't need nuclear reactors, then you can say, let's just get, like, the safest world is the one without any kind of nuclear technology, and this really resonates with his audiences, and he mostly speaks in echo chambers, which is another thing about him, and most anti-nuclear spokesman as well. He's invited to a lot of echo chambers, by which I mean he's saying a view that he knows 90% of the audience is going to echo back to him, and so he feels that resonance, and he really starts to. He doesn't do so well in a non-echo chamber environment, so he rightly, I guess, sticks to the echo chambers. But he can say things like, "We don't need nuclear power. Look at Germany; they're not using nuclear power because there's this belief that they got rid of it and they're doing just fine." And visually, you see wind turbines, and you think, "Well, they're what's powering Germany now," which is not true. But he knows he can say that, and nobody's likely to challenge him. So he doesn't have, so the disadvantage that people like I have in going into that discussion is that I know that nuclear power is necessary, or something very much like it. If not nuclear power, then some other large, reliable, abundant nuclear or clean energy source. It's not the things that are being offered by his crowd. And so if you assume that you do need to have nuclear power, then you've got to do something about this yin and yang of you could make plutonium for weapons, and so you need to deal with that, and that's very, very complicated. And it's why you have this institution here with thousands of people, been around since 1957 and implementing the Non-proliferation Treaty since the early 70s, and going to 183 countries on the planet, doing inspections daily, even during a global pandemic when nobody was flying anywhere. There was one organization that did not stop going to every country on the planet, even if they had to drive across borders and do 3 weeks of quarantine and to do 3 days of inspection. So we have to think about that. And yes, we are a pro-nuclear organization. The International Atomic Energy Agency grew out of the Atoms for Peace movement. That the U.S. proposal that this is too beneficial to mankind to just keep within the countries where it was invented. We need to be able to irradiate crops to get rid of pestilence, to extend the shelf life of food, to fight cancer, to provide abundant electricity, so the other 2/3 of the population of the planet that doesn't have access to reliable electricity can maybe have a light turned on in the evening and maybe read a book and maybe learn something about the rest of the world. And it's not just subsistence living. And all of this was being imagined in the 50s, and so it was utopian, but it wasn't wrong. They had to do something about the way it couldn't continue the way the world was looking at that time. And so the IAEA is the institution that came into effect in the late 1950s to help spread the value of nuclear technology. And then when the Non-proliferation Treaty came along at the end of the 60s, it was the logical organization to house the Department of Safeguards, which is, along with all of that yin, you have the yang of the weapons, and you want to not have the two connected. And it was the 5 weapon states, the P5, so US, France, UK, China, and Russia, as defined by that treaty, the countries that had exploded to that point in time nuclear weapons in the late 1960s. So if that dotted line was the mid 1970s, you'd have India, for example, in there, and India wouldn't be a country that exploded a device outside of common global support. It would be, oh yes, there are 6. There's now a P6 sort of thing. But so there's a dotted line at the beginning of the 1970s, and so the IAEA.
There's no coincidence that the members of the Security Council, the permanent members, are all the nuclear weapon states, right?
Yes, it's no coincidence whatsoever. And part of the NPT, the Non-proliferation Treaty, by the way, is which is also signed by the weapon states, is an agreement by them to work towards disarmament. They haven't progressed very far on that part of the NPT.
Not working that hard.
But basically, it's an agreement that if nuclear technology is to be shared globally, it has to be done securely as well. And so you are agreeing to have, as I mentioned before, safeguards on all of your nuclear activities, and if you're not one of these 5 countries. So a country like Canada, for instance, has inspectors coming on a daily, weekly basis to the nuclear facilities, not just the reactors, but the process, the fuel fabrication facilities, the fuel storage facilities, the nuclear laboratories, McMaster University with its reactor. They all get visited, even small amounts of nuclear technology, even the hospitals that have cobalt-60, or they have depleted uranium shielding in cancer therapy machines. So it all gets visited, and it's just to keep tabs on who has nuclear material and what are they doing with it. And it's interesting because this secure framework is actually enabled by civilian nuclear technology. So because you have, and this speaks to Gordon Edwards' thesis that you can just get rid of nuclear technology, you can make everything illegal. Nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, just doing something with uranium that splits it is illegal, and having plutonium is illegal. And I have pointed out to him in the past that, well, first of all, making something illegal, of course, doesn't make it go away. So let's assume
prohibition was pretty successful.
Let's recognize, yes, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It will be around. It's just now it's underground, and so then he would propose, well, then you of course need a IAEA-like organization that is checking into this. Well, I say, well, guess what? We have the IAEA, and because we have a civilian nuclear industry globally, that puts the boots on the ground. That is, and uniquely, we are uniquely able to go into these countries legally, and with very little notice, and knock on the front door and like show me to your uranium, and it better be there. And not just that, but we can go to other places in many countries that where maybe we suspect there's something going on, and we can take a sample. We can take a sample of the dust on a desk of a professor's office, where there should not be plutonium isotopes, but maybe we have a reason to think that there's some R&D going on there in plutonium separation or something. And he sent the samples back to Austria. I was going to say Vienna, but it's actually about half an hour south of Vienna, where there's a IAEA laboratory, and they test it and they look for plutonium. And this happens all the time, daily, all year round.
So, I mean, it kind of sounds like almost like a spy agency in some ways, but that's wild, and I'm sure there's all kinds of stories, and I'm curious about the relevance to the Iraq War, and I think Saddam was refusing IAEA inspections. Like it's not all roses. This probably has some challenges. An agency that's supposed to be able to just walk in and be kind of invasive, and
there's some easier places in the world to verify,
right?
And there's some.
So tell me about a place that's been challenging, or I mean, obviously there's been states that have gotten around this. I think about North Korea. I'm sure there's a few other examples, but nothing is perfect, and I'm sure Gordon Edwards' IAEA police would be, it's kind of like a global super cop or something that imagines it would be perfect, but. And that was, again, I think one of the key pieces of advice for me, because, you can go into a debate like this, ultra partisan, and, you're in such a defensive mindset that you don't want to concede anything. And I think the wisdom that you really imparted on me is like, you have to concede it. Yes, every nuclear reactor in the world makes plutonium. Yes, if we go the reprocessing route to reuse nuclear waste, that, is a step towards making proliferation easier. We have to up the safeguards to match that. And for me, again, it was very useful framing, because I could say, well, again, this is risk, this is a medical conversation, essentially, risks, benefits, and alternatives, and then informed consent. As a society, do we decide that we want to do, pyro reprocessing to use that spent nuclear fuel, or to develop, fast reactor technology? And right now, maybe there's not uranium's cheap. Maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe the urgency will be there later. Who knows? I don't have a strong opinion on it. But I think it was just very useful. It really made me more relaxed in the debate to just be like, yeah, acknowledge that. But then again, have a rational response to.
Well, I think what it comes down to is critical analysis. It's critical analysis. There's pros and cons. There's advantages and disadvantages, and we do it all the time. So we have streets and we have cars going down those streets, and it's very close to the sidewalk, and we don't have big concrete walls between the sidewalk and the street. So there's a certain risk that you're going to wander out into the street, and it does happen. And everybody knows that if you walk out in the street and a truck hits you, you will die. It's instant, and it's a risk that we take, and we judge that against what if we didn't have the cars coming through the city? Well, we don't want that, and so I think we know enough to keep ourselves on the sidewalk, and that's a risk that we can deal with. And if there is an issue in a certain situation, a certain location, well, we do put little barriers up, and we have lights and so on. So we address it, and so everybody is very well aware of how we critically analyze the risks around us. But for some reason, nuclear doesn't fall into that. People do not give that flexibility to nuclear. It's just one of those things where you say nuclear, say the word nuclear, and people, most people, I have this theory that there is no neutral opinion on nuclear technology. People might say they don't care about it, apathetic, I haven't thought about it much, not too worried about it. But then as soon as a tidal wave washes over a reactor in East Japan, and there's an issue, and it's on CNN, and they're showing oil refineries burning, and the ticker on the bottom says it's a reactor on fire, people go, yes, I knew that. I knew that was a problem with that tech. I always suspected that, And they're fed this all the time through various means all the time, from like The Simpsons and jokes on the side, and when I say I work at Chalk River Laboratories, oh yeah, have you blown anything up lately? Was always the next thing I heard. Or do you glow in the dark? And ha ha ha. But so it didn't worry me too much. People were saying that, but it just shows that the immediate reaction never was, oh, so you're helping to provide 80% of the world's medical isotopes. Because of course they had no idea. Which goes to another issue, which is our poor history of communications. But so nuclear isn't accorded that flexibility, and people like Gordon Edwards know this. They know that they can just throw out, let's get rid of nuclear power, and you'd have 90% of the room just nodding, saying, yeah, I didn't think it did anything for us. I mean, there's windmills. Why do we need that? They're not going to say, wait a minute, let's see what nuclear does for us and put it in this column, and let's see what its challenges are and what we do about it. So we never talk about safeguards in those kind of environments. So you have to twist Gordon Edwards' arm to talk about safeguards. He'll just slough off safeguards and say that's just, that doesn't work. That's people checking on other people. And of course, human nature is to agree with that and say, yeah, people checking on other people, that doesn't work. We have laws against doing drugs and laws against drinking in public, and I sure know how to get around that one. So. But now if you transfer that to the idea of nuclear technology, and all of a sudden it's scary because now it's not just any bomb, but it's a bomb that I can blow up a whole city with, and people like Gordon Edwards nurture this inherent feeling that people have, and I think it is inherent. So when people like you and I walk into a room, you are already behind the 8 ball, even if it's a room purportedly supposedly of neutral people. You've got to move them off that square of sort of inherent negativity.
I feel that all the time. I did basically a town hall with my local MP, who's a great guy, Arif Farani. He has nothing nuclear. Like, there's a lot of Ontario electoral districts that have a lot of nuclear going on, and those politicians are aware of it and are champions for the sector. But Arif we're Parkdale High Park. This is a NDP Green kind of bastion, swings NDP and Liberal. Both of those two parties are not super friendly with nuclear. So he's taken a risk, basically because he's been convinced, partially by listening, his constituents and himself listening to Decouple every once in a while, to really champion nuclear. So anyway, he had me to a town hall, and he was like, "Do you want to have a debate?" And I was like, "Not really. I mean, I'm not afraid of a debate, but I just think it's going to not be a quality conversation." And he's like, "Well, how about I play devil's advocate and I'll just ask you all the questions?" And it was a bit of an exhausting night. I'd worked a shift that day and came to it, and it's just like there's such a positive story to be told here, and we've completely lost the narrative if we're just responding. Like, yes, clearly we have to address this concern of, I don't know, there should be an acronym for it, but like, waste, weapons, and accidents or something, the WWA of nuclear. But like, there's a really positive story to be told here, in terms
waste,
of
weapons, and whoops, maybe.
Yeah, that's good. You got a better way with acronyms than I do. Maybe that's the IAEA in you or something. But yeah, I mean, there's a positive story to be told here, right? And we've mentioned it. Phasing out coal in Ontario, the medical isotopes, the actual just transition for fossil fuel workers. The ways in which nuclear just uplifts human potential. Like, this is the thing I keep coming back to with people is, yes, is banging up, foreign-made wind panels, solar panels on frames. Is that a risky construction project? No, it's easy. These are on budget, on time, sort of bits of infrastructure. But what's the value proposition, right? And so nuclear requires just this extraordinary amount of human potential. But in requiring it, it buoys up, the people involved, who get higher educations, higher standards of skills if they're skilled tradespeople, incredible project management skills. And, nuclear can flounder when those ingredients aren't there. But, that's part anyway of this sort of more positive story that I think we don't get a chance to express enough because we're just constantly on the defensive. And I think those times are changing because of, novel communicators like, this kind of global nuclear advocacy community. But also just, the winds are blowing in our favor. And that's all, why I'm saying, like, it's almost irrelevant to talk about the anti-nuclear mindset because it's unfortunately, it's very gray haired. Like, there's some saying that's a bit harsh, but it's like, for an idea to die, sometimes the people that hold it have to kind of go along with it. But again, I
wish I had more gray hair.
I don't know. Looking at you, I'm really not sure what your age is. You seem kind of timeless. Maybe it's that hormesis effect.
I'm an avatar.
Okay. Anyway, that again, a bit of a long diatribe from me, but I was struck by your yin yang language, and within the yin yang, there's a little dot of white in the black and a little dot of black in the white. So let's go back to proliferation and talk about some of the challenges and not necessarily, I guess, kind of the exceptions to the rule in terms of states that have broken the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. How did that happen, and was that sort of a breakdown? Like, what would you give credit to for countries doing that? What were the costs that they had to pay? Just give me a sense of that. How do we keep people in line in terms of being this kind of global policeman on
Yeah.
proliferation?
So ultimately, the IAEA, we're just the ones who verify. We don't enforce, and so we go and we inspect, and we have like an objective assessment of what the countries are doing. We draw a conclusion, and we pass that to the board of directors for the IAEA. And ultimately, if it's actually a case of a country is proliferating, it becomes a Security Council issue. So it's just elevated to that level. And then where it goes from there, it's out of our hands. And there's various different examples. You look at your North Korea, which is a case where it was detected that they were doing things they shouldn't with their nuclear technology.
How was it detected? And what nuclear technology did they have? What was their route to getting weapons?
Yeah, so they had reactors, and they were misusing the reactors, and they were basically trying to do irradiations, put targets into the reactors, using
These
the
are
fuel as
research
targets.
reactors, power reactors.
Power reactors, yeah. And it went back and forth, and eventually they just the thing about the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is there is a clause to get out of it. You have to give advance
Right.
notice, and then you can just withdraw from it, as any treaty would have, sort of thing. You wouldn't sign it otherwise. And so they did that. They just said, you know what, we're out, and they've been out ever since.
But they were detected first before they
Yes,
did that.
yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah.
And do you know the particular story there, or how it was detected, or?
Well, no, I can't get into the details of that. But it
Okay.
was basically through the measures applied by the IAEA,
Sampling of dust from a professor's desk, perhaps.
and also
Maybe you've already revealed too much, Jeremy.
at the same time, we aren't the only people that are keeping eyes on certain countries. So at the same time, you have the
Right.
intelligence community knows a lot about what's going on, and there's a general convergence of knowledge of what's going on in a country, and diplomatic pressure is applied. To the point where we thought we were fixing the issue, and by like we're mitigating, and we were changing their technology even, and then they transgressed again, and that's when they just basically pulled the plug and left the system, and ever since then they've just been sort of running with a nuclear weapons program, and so the IAEA has nothing to do with what happened since then. Everything since then is the rest of the world keeping eyes on it, and it's not to do with the IAEA, except that the IAEA is ready to go back in at any point if they invite us back in, like if they come back into the fold. Then you have countries like, so the big one was Iraq in the early 90s, where we were doing safeguards much more simply prior to that, where basically the country tells us what they're doing, where the reactors are, and anything else involving nuclear technology, and we go in and inspect and verify, yes, what you have declared is correct. And what was missing from that, and it always included the idea that we should be making sure that nothing undeclared is going on elsewhere in the country. We just didn't do as much about it back then, because of various reasons, including not having the resources to do it. Well, to have more resources, you need to have the will of the people who are funding you, which are the member states of the IAEA, and that happened in the early 90s when it was detected that there was misuse of the technology going on in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, and so there was a realization that he was doing this in facilities that were right next door to the ones that were being inspected, but the IAEA had no legal right to go to those neighboring facilities. And so there was an immediate recognition by the world that we needed to fix this, that we had the statute of the IAEA allows us to go in with a view to looking at the state as a whole, but the measures, the tools that we had were very limited and pretty much focused on the declared facility. So we needed to be able to go anywhere in the state. First of all, anywhere on a site, anywhere on a nuclear site, let alone, never mind the country, but also to go anywhere in the country. To have strengthening of safeguards. And that's what happened as a result of the Iraq transgressions in the early 90s. And then much of Iraq's situation was ended up being dealt with through military means, and so that wasn't anything to do with the IAEA. But and
the WMD wasn't there.
Yeah, eventually. I mean, the second time when the country was basically annihilated, and it came out that no, they had sort of gotten rid of the WMD at the first time round, and then the political motivations took over afterwards. And so that's all history. And then you have Iran, which had ideas about developing nuclear weapons and kind of went down that path, and again detected by the system. And then you had, on top of the NPT, you had the Iran nuclear treaty that was negotiated by the P5 plus other countries. And the IAEA was then used as the verifier of that treaty, but that's different from the NPT. So we have always been implementing the NPT verification activities in Iran, and on top of that, there's much more restrictive activities under the JCPOA, which is their particular treaty.
Trump scrapped that. Has Biden brought it back?
That's the one that the U.S. walked away from. And so that's the one that's in trouble because the leader of the free world walked away from it, which basically it's not good for global treaties when the USA does that.
Okay, so I'm drawing some very strong comparisons between the countries we're talking about, and maybe Libya was in there as well for a while, but all of these countries are basically under threat by the US of regime change. Is that not a startling? I mean, and the U.S. is the leader of the free world and sort of the global superpower. And I'm not going to ask you. You probably have some limitations on what you can say. But I mean, maybe I'll just do the editorial here. But I mean, that's kind of extraordinary. And again, I'm not sure the exact timing of North Korea getting the bomb, but I think it may have been after Saddam was overthrown or dragged out of his bunker. All bearded and looking absolutely miserable. I think it was before Gaddafi was stabbed to death and thrown into an irrigation canal. Not to make any comment on, the quality of human being of these individuals, but Iran similarly under threat from the U.S. in some pretty major ways. When I think about a new non-proliferation treaty, I think it might, in terms of the motivation for states to get weapons, and I think this comes back to that point of, there's no stuffing the nuclear genie back in the bottle when it comes to this fantasy that will lead to the elimination of weapons. What drives weapons proliferation are these geopolitical tensions. Because from what I understand, it's really, really expensive to develop, to get the expertise and to maintain the credible threat of deployment, whether that's your nuclear triad of Air Force, ground missile weapons and submarines. To be a credible user of those weapons, it's an absolutely enormous economic undertaking with big potential headaches. And maybe we'll get to India in a second, and because I think it was interesting, they were kind of starved of nuclear fuel because they don't have their own uranium, and some of their beloved pressurized heavy water reactors are actually offline for extended periods of time because of the NPT treaty. But maybe I'm jumping ahead too far. If there's anything else you wanted to say about the Iran, Iraq, North Korea thing. One thing I'm particularly curious about, as you said, because this has been a sort of pro-nuclear narrative of mine, is that power reactors don't don't necessarily, or actually pretty rarely, lead to the production of nuclear weapons. But you're saying in North Korea they did have power reactors. Were these large reactors or just kind of cover power reactors to develop the weapons, or what was going on there?
Well, they had power reactors that were more easily misused for making weapons. But
they were supplying electricity to Pyongyang or something.
Yeah, they're like dual use systems. Okay. So one of the outcomes
what for the nerds out there, were they like RBMK style reactors, or what? Yeah. They were Chernobyl style RBMKs.
They were like graphite reactors, and so So one of the outcomes of the initial interaction of the world was, in particular the U.S., was to replace those reactors with light water reactors, which can still make plutonium, but just the extraction of plutonium from those reactors is not as easy as from a reactor like they had. And so that was the first thing that was going on, and then that all sort of fell by the wayside when they continued to show that they had aspirations to have a weapon. So yes, it's just a fact of nuclear fission that when you split uranium in half, you release neutrons. Those neutrons, you want a lot of them to go and split other uranium neutrons, when uranium atoms, but when you get hit by a neutron, and your uranium, you might split in half, or you might just become one neutron heavier. And there's a certain chance that you will do that and not split. And when you become one neutron heavier, you then go through a series of decays and you end up as plutonium. And the plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, so that's where it stops for all intents and purposes. So in any reactor, you get a buildup, you get uranium atoms fissioning, and you get a buildup of plutonium. And so this happens in CANDU reactors, and light water reactors, RBMK reactors, and in military production reactors. But then what happens also is that so the plutonium that you create is very pure at that point. It's plutonium-239. It's a certain kind of plutonium, the kind that is useful in weapons. But the fuel hasn't gone anywhere, and it's still in the reactor, and it's still exposed to these neutrons. And so now the plutonium is absorbing neutrons and becoming one neutron heavier, or two neutrons heavier, or three neutrons heavier. And those heavier types of plutonium are not good for weapons. And so that's why you have reactor-grade plutonium, which is plutonium that's been in fuel, that's been in the reactor for a year or more. And you have weapons-grade plutonium, which has been quickly removed from the reactor before these heavier forms of plutonium build in. And that's the main difference in operation of a military reactor versus a power reactor.
And the RBMK styles allow you to get that, to cook the plutonium to just the 230.
It was developed more as a dual use.
Yeah. So just briefly, without getting too nerdy here, but we do have a lot of nerds in the audience. So why is the isotopic purity of the plutonium important? What happens with that plutonium 240, 241, 242? I heard about a fizzle. It can do a fizzle.
Yeah,
which sounds not good.
Well, the main thing is that they emit neutrons. They themselves emit neutrons, those higher forms of plutonium. And so when you have a weapon, what makes a weapon versus just a bunch of heat, is that when you have a bomb, what makes a bomb is that you have a lot of energy released in a very short amount of time. So it's that window of the energy release. So for a nuclear weapon, you want if it's, let's say, two half pieces of uranium to evoke the simplest type of nuclear weapon coming together. You figure out what the critical mass of uranium is. You get that amount. You split it in half. Or maybe you don't have it together to begin with, because that would be dangerous. But you get two half amounts of that, and then you bring it together really quickly, as quickly as you can. So they do this by basically keeping one stationary and firing another one in a gun barrel at the other one, and that's the fastest that we can move a chunk of material.
That's the Hiroshima design, right?
Yes, that's the Hiroshima.
Highly enriched uranium. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the Hiroshima. So it's like the gun barrel design. Not as popular today because we mostly use the implosion design, which was the Nagasaki design. But basically, in the simple design, you bring in these two halves together. When they're coming together, even though they're traveling at projectile speeds, it seems fast to us, but at subatomic levels, that's really slow, because these things travel at high fractions of the speed of light. And so as the pieces are coming together, if there's any radiation coming from those two pieces, which there would be from uranium, it's going to be going across and being absorbed in the other piece of uranium. So if it's gamma rays, alpha particles, they are not going to initiate fission. But if it's neutrons that are being transferred back and forth, as you're coming towards the other piece, you're going to have fission starting to build up. And now what you want to have is the two pieces come together with no fission. Then you inject your starting neutron, and then the chain reaction happens, and you have a very fast chain reaction in a short amount of time, and then the whole thing blows itself apart, and it ends. The chain reaction ends. You don't want the chain reaction to start long before the pieces come together. So for uranium, this is not an issue because there's not enough neutrons flying around from the uranium itself. By the way, that's one way to if you talk about neutralizing nuclear weapons, one way to do that is to bathe it in neutrons, because you're basically like pre-detonating it before the thing gets to. So it's like the flak gun of nuclear weapons is a bunch of
Wow.
neutrons. So then if it's all game theory. If you're a nuclear weapons designer in the modern day, there are ways to design a nuclear weapon that's more resistant to this, and so and on it goes. But back to this.
Sorry, but there actually is a mechanism to sort of shoot a neutron ray gun at bomb. Like, how would that happen? When would you? Is it a superhero that goes around with a little neutron
with a
gun
neutron beam coming out of it? Yeah. So there are ways to have neutron sources, strong neutron sources that you can have near. You can fire up in the air, and
from the air.
Yeah, I mean, you can even have yourself, you can even have a counter nuclear weapon, if you will, that emits more neutrons than anything else, and bathes the other weapon in neutrons. And so modern weapons are able to resist this.
Is that the neutron bomb? Is that the neutron bomb?
A type of neutron bomb, yes, where you maximize the neutrons being emitted. Yeah. So for uranium, it's not an issue, and that's why as soon as they discovered fission in uranium, they knew right away they can make a weapon, and nothing that happened after that, and this is during World War II, nothing that happened after that in the Manhattan Project told them that anything would prevent this from happening. So they were so sure of it, they never had to test it at all. The first nuclear weapon that they used was the one dropped on Hiroshima. They just knew it would work.
But Trinity, they did Trinity test first, right?
Trinity was a plutonium weapon. And so for that one, now we get to the plutonium story. So
got you.
So in those early days, when they discovered fission of uranium, they didn't know anything about plutonium at that time. They discovered that uranium fissions, and they discovered that one of these things that builds up is plutonium. And so they started looking into plutonium more and its properties. And oh, look, it fissions as well. Isn't this great? You can take a rock that generates energy, and while it's generating energy, whether it's a bomb or in a reactor, it's also generating more fuel, and that in itself is a unique thing about nuclear. So, but in the context of
breeder reactor, right?
Yeah, well, that maximizes that aspect to make more fuel. But in the context of World War II, they were just saying, "Oh, look at this other fissile material that it creates, which is good because we don't have a lot of uranium that we can use, which is enriched, because they had to enrich the uranium in the part which is less than 1%, the uranium-235. And they're rapidly trying to, which is like the largest industry on the planet at the time, to try and do it, the largest factory, and they're trying to do that before the war ends. But they said, oh, this is great. Somebody's handed us this other material that is created. And look, we can create it. If we can just get this reactor to work, a large enough reactor to work, we're going to make plutonium with the uranium that we have, and you can extract the plutonium, and make a nuclear weapon out of that. But then they discovered that the fuel, the plutonium they extract from the fuel has these heavier forms of plutonium, and enough of them are emitting neutrons. Even if you have relatively pure plutonium, you're going to have enough of these heavier ones that this is going to be an issue. And so this gets to this fizzle you were talking about, where the two pieces, let's say they're coming together in that gun barrel, they would be talking to each other, and the fission reaction would start. So you'd get a large increase of energy. You'd have a large, it would even be an explosion. It wouldn't be a militarily useful city flattening type of explosion, but you would have a large, and I don't want to sound like I'm supporting any of this, actually, which is part of the problem of this topic, by the way, that you very quickly, people start thinking that you're supporting nuclear weapons. But you can have a fizzle bomb. It is a bomb, and it would explode. You could have a truck bomb with this kind of plutonium, and it would be much larger than the terrorist diesel fuel fertilizer bombs that we have, and you can bring down buildings with it. And Gordon Edwards will talk about that. This is when he says that any kind of plutonium can be used in a weapon. That's what he means. He doesn't mean that any military would use this, but somebody could get a hold of it and have a pretty good bump. And so there's a whole story there about why you probably wouldn't do that. It's far more complex than just getting a bunch of diesel and fertilizer.
Yeah. So we've talked about nation states that have escaped the NPT and have made weapons, and we have, I think, a decent understanding of how they did that, dual-use reactors, et cetera, and just saying, screw off NPT, go away IAEA, we're doing this. Big diplomatic price, and I think we'll get into that when talking about India in a moment. But the other threat that Edwards brings up here, and again, there's a lot of stuff that's theoretically possible but highly improbable. How do terrorists get plutonium? How do they get it? Like, what would be some? And again, I know you probably need to be quite theoretical in this answer. I'm not trying to give anyone ideas, but like, is what Gordon Edwards is evoking is that they would extract it from nuclear waste? What's I imagine like stockpiles of plutonium are pretty carefully.
It's extremely difficult to extract plutonium. Yes, yeah. So the most capable countries on the planet have a hard time extracting plutonium from spent fuel. So almost nobody does it. There's an advantage to doing it if you don't have uranium, if you don't have large amounts of uranium as Canada does, and so you might want to recycle your fuel and extract. And simply looking at it, you would say, well, why not? Because of course we should recycle it. Why would you take this resource? Well, the reason
and that's what MOX fuel is, right? Like when France
yes,
at The Hague is reprocessing,
fuel, yes.
They're taking like mostly plutonium out, I guess a bit of U-235 that's left, and mixing that into
You're basically getting rid of the fission products, the garbage, the half pieces of uranium which are useless to you. Not only useless, they're a detriment. They're absorbing neutrons.
And that's not easy. I mean, The Hague is like an absolutely massive facility, right? And it just I'm thinking about the mechanics of handling, nuclear waste. Unshielded again, you're getting acute radiation syndrome and dying in like 5-6 seconds of being a meter away. What does that look like? Hot cells,
yep. It's
chemical baths.
It's robotic machinery and remotely controlled machinery, and thick shielding and meter thick glass and all of that stuff that you see in The Simpsons, except for the part where he's taking the green goo and putting it in his back pocket. That doesn't happen. But everything else, the control of it is there for health and safety reasons and also security reasons, and it's very difficult. And so from a simple point of view, we should be doing this with all of our reactors, extracting this useful material. But the fact is, most countries don't, and the reason they don't is because they don't have to, because uranium is literally dirt cheap today. And if it wasn't, as it wasn't in the old days when nuclear started, and the people developing the technology said, "Oh my God, if things take off the way if we extrapolate, we're going to need to." Some MOX fuel, we're going to need to extract the plutonium and mix it with the uranium and put that in the reactors. We need to take this thing called thorium, which is even more abundant than uranium in the Earth's crust. And if you expose thorium to neutrons, it turns into uranium. So that's something else that was discovered, and we can do that as well. So the origins of the Canadian nuclear program actually were heavily built around the thorium fuel cycle, before we realize we have the mother lode of uranium in the Earth. And so it's just natural then when you do discover you have that there is a lot of uranium, then the incentive to invest the billions needed to develop these other fuel cycles kind of peters away, and to the point where it's been at the R&D level in national labs ever since, now making a comeback with SMRs at a much smaller scale. So you're seeing all these ideas that were popular in the 50s and 60s come back now, often because it's people who are working on it back then are retired and have time on their hands.
Yeah, my cynical read of it coming back, and let's be clear, these are not reactors that are getting built, they're blueprints, is that this is part of a public relations battle around nuclear waste being this intolerable thing. So we're going to win a public relations affair and attract some venture capital by solving the nuclear waste problem and doing a bunch of reprocessing. It's not an economic imperative. Again, as you mentioned, uranium is dirt cheap. It's cool. It's a really great science experiment, and it will have relevance in our nuclear powered future, no doubt. As uranium ores deplete, and at some point, if we build enough nuclear reactors, we are going to start really working our way through the easily exploitable uranium reserves. So I fully support developing the technology, but I do find like that there's really not an economic case for it. Anyway, maybe that's beyond your purview, but
well, I think I'm in favor of it because I'm not only a nuclear nerd, but I know that we have, let's say 200 years of uranium left at the economic level that we have for extracting it now. And the caveat there is as it runs out, of course, you find more uranium, because then you're driving the searching for it. For example, when we found the mother lode of uranium under Saskatchewan, we stopped looking at that point. But there's probably more elsewhere in that area, and it's just that it's very expensive to go down into
prospect for it. Yeah, we're going to do an episode. We're going to do an episode on that soon. But I was talking to the CEO of Standard Uranium, which is a prospecting firm up there, and yeah, it's tricky. Yes, it gives off radiation, but anyway, we'll get into that with him because I'm not.
So I'm in favor of all those technologies, and here at the IAEA, I'm heavily involved in working up what the safeguards of those technologies might be, and so that's really, really interesting work. But I realize that we do have to expand the use of nuclear power on this planet. It's not going to be with these technologies. We should absolutely be working on the hairy edge of the technologies that are available to us, and so more power to you. And if you can build some prototypes, even better. But we haven't exhausted the traditional style yet, or not traditional style, but the advanced version of the traditional style. And so those reactors, I think, we should be building more CANDU, like enhanced CANDU reactors, advanced CANDU reactors in Canada, and advanced version of light water reactors.
And we, as just well to remind as people, we have one through the vendor design review, the enhanced CANDU 6. So those are not fantasy objects; they do exist. We're running out of time, Jeremy. I mean, we're going to have you back to dive deeper, but and I know it's not the IAEA's purview to make up the consequences for when a country, bans the NPT. But, in my discussion with and research before interviewing, this grandfather of not only nuclear energy, but also nuclear weapons in India, Dr. Anil Kokadar, India did run into some issues as a result of exiting the NPT. Can you tell me a little bit about, I know it's not the enforcement of the IAEA, but what are the consequences? We've talked about how hard it would be for terrorists to do this, but what are the consequences that countries face for withdrawing from the NPT, and maybe use India as a specific example?
Yeah, so India, you can use it as an analogy as a proxy for withdrawing from the NPT, but the truth is they couldn't sign the NPT in the first place. And so that's because the NPT doesn't have a space for them. If you sign the NPT, you're either one of the 5 allowed nuclear weapon states, or you're not. And if you're not, that means you don't have nuclear. There's no square for people that have nuclear weapons but aren't the P5 states. So India has not signed the NPT simply because they can't. They'd have to give up their nuclear weapons, and they don't want to do that. And why do they have nuclear weapons? Well, the same reason that the U.S. has nuclear weapons, because they have an enemy, or a perceived enemy, in their case a real enemy, that also has nuclear weapons, and they want it for the same reason.
Interestingly, that was not Pakistan, because Pakistan came after. That was China. That's what I find fascinating. And obviously there's been border conflicts between China and India. And, my friend Mark Nelson was joking about, this is what a border conflict looks like between 2 nuclear armed powers. And basically it was stick fighting. I think there was someone who maybe got killed or injured, but, that is an interesting aspect of it. But
yeah.
Anyway, then there was a domino effect because Pakistan got the bomb as well. And
right,
when does the domino stop? It's a geopolitical question, I guess. But
so
what were the consequences?
Doesn't have to support that, but you recognize that they made this decision for the same reason that other countries that have weapons made the same decision. So. But they had received nuclear assistance from Canada and the U.S. in the form of a research reactor, and then we were in the process of building a couple of power reactors in India, and it was under this agreement, pre-safeguards, pre-IAEA safeguards. So that we had a rudimentary form of safeguards, but it wasn't what you see even in the mid-70s, let alone what we have today. And let's just say what it was more of a gentleman's agreement. You won't use this for evil, right? Yes, I won't. Okay. And so then, but they did. And as soon as they did, then all nuclear cooperation from the world was dropped, and then they were basically isolated. And they, to their credit, continued to develop their nuclear program, not just sort of reverse engineering the reactors that were partially finished in their country and building them a lot more like that, but saying, well, look, we don't have uranium and we're not going to be able to buy uranium from the world, so how else can we make uranium? Well, we can do this thing where you make you breed plutonium into the fuel, and we can also do this thing where you put thorium in. We have a lot of thorium, and we can make uranium with that. So they had this multi-pronged approach to their nuclear program. And they proceeded to do that for the next few decades. And so more power to them, literally, more power to them for doing that and expanding their nuclear program. But all of that was without the cooperation of the globe. And not every country has the ability to do that. So when you cross the line, you are cut off. And you become then the focus of the other parts of the world's security infrastructure for making sure that you don't cross the line even further. So the military gets involved if that's what the Security Council wants to do, sort of thing. And so all of this comes down on you when you decide to use nuclear technology for non-peaceful purposes.
Okay, Jeremy, fascinating. We'll park it there because we do try and keep to an hour. But I have no doubt we'll be talking in the very near future if you'll be so gracious as to return to this humble podcast.
Is this like Saturday Night Live? I get to say I'm a three-time host, maybe? Not a host, I guess. A three-time guest.
You got to earn it. You got to earn it, but I think you will soon. Okay, well, I mean, I feel like that's an abrupt halt. If there's anything else you wanted to get off on the non-proliferation side, I'd invite you to do it now. You don't have to forever hold your peace, but you don't have to hold it till we next speak.
Yeah, I think there's so much more to say on proliferation that we can leave that for another episode. But I would like to say that one final observation on the great debate was I find it interesting that the argument made was about SMRs, against SMRs, is that we can't develop them fast enough to solve the climate crisis. And to me, this is a bit amusing because part of the reason we haven't expanded the nuclear in industry to date and not had the climate crisis in the first place was because of people like that who opposed it. But it's interesting to me that a person can be opportunistic enough to not say their real reason, which is I don't like nuclear technology, but to move to but you just can't build it fast enough. It's like, okay, so that's where we are now, that we can't build it.
But so we would love your cooperation to help streamline and speed it up.
And if you want, we can build these things in 3 years, right? I mean, that's what AECL was talking about at one point.
Right.
Technically, you can build them in 3 years, and then everything else added on is the administrative stuff and the reviews and all of that stuff, which is needed. But I mean, the actual building of it, we could be building these things every 3 years if you could somehow prioritize the other aspects of it. So if that's what you want, if it's important enough, we can do it. Are you saying it's important enough? And of course, that's not what they're saying, but it's just, that's why I find it interesting that you lead off with speed of construction.
It was interesting because I was heading into the Lion's Den. The event was organized by Gordon Edwards, one of his chief kind of collaborators and partners in, I won't say crime, in anti-nuclearism, Susan O'Donnell. The other organizer, Ryan, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. I mean, he's not an anti-nuclear activist, but certainly on the record, on the record all over Twitter with pretty anti-nuclear sentiment. So it was going into the Lion's Den, and I think it was interesting because I think they really thought they were going to, like, Edwards was going to deliver the knockout blow, and preparing for it, it was a bit nerve-wracking because I'm not a proliferation expert, I'm not a weapons expert, but again, I wanted to thank you for helping me arrive not just at that rhetorical understanding, but at that kind of deeper understanding of the anti-nuclear mindset and of the need to acknowledge what must be acknowledged, but to have a critical reasoning-based approach to discussing this technology. So
it's Jeremy, really what it comes down to. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for everything, for your mentorship and advice, and for coming back on Decouple, and let's make it a hat trick soon.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure talking to you soon.